Our first speaker this evening is Emily Pearce, and she's going to be introduced by our educational chair, Jim Glickman.
Thank you, Chris. Tonight we have our Eric P. Newman lectures. We used to have an educational evening back in the day, but we've changed it to the Eric P. Newman lectures. And we have two very exciting ones tonight. A little bit of serendipity. Last year, as you may remember, we had two thematically related talks. And this year, it wasn't particularly planned to happen that way, but we have two talks that are thematically related, both having to do with coins and institutions. So our first speaker, and the other bit of serendipity, little factoid, is that our two speakers once knew each other. They grew up and they went to a private high school where they knew each other way back in the day in Connecticut. So what are the chances of that happening? So tonight is really a little bit of fate intervening. Our first speaker, Emily Pearce, is the assistant curator of numismatics at the Yale Art Gallery, and her talk is entitled Accessing Numismatic Items in Museums. And she's going to really talk about two things: generally accessing numismatic items and how museums treat numismatic items, and then as a case study, she'll be talking about particularly what is there to be seen and enjoyed in the Yale Art Gallery itself in New Haven, Connecticut. So without further ado, I'd like to present Emily Pearce.
Good evening, everyone. So just over a year ago, I had the great pleasure of being invited to join you all as one of the Newman lecturers for this year's C4 convention. I am so grateful for this honor and must begin by thanking Jim and Chris McDowell for this kind invitation. As Jim said, I am Emily Pearce, and I have the pleasure of being the assistant curator of numismatics at the Yale University Art Gallery in New Haven, Connecticut. Being with C4 tonight is a particular boon for me, as I am determined to bring Yale's US holdings back into the zeitgeist of collectors across our nation. This next hour is going to look a little bit different compared to prior Newman lectures. Rather than a deep dive into a single object, artist, or numismatist, I will spend the evening defining some museum staff roles that you all should be familiar with, their hierarchies, and museum search engines, using Yale as a case study. The reason for this deviation is simple. Jim told me to. I have seen, however, throughout my time in museum numismatic collections, the rampant confusion and frankly frustrations which so often occur between collectors seeking object information or images and museum staff members. And it is on this very topic that Jim requested I make a few remarks. I do feel particularly poised to help address this perplexity, as I am a product of both the museum and numismatic worlds. My hate gets me every time. It's the box all over again. No.
There you go.
A quick note, I will be discussing numismatic collections housed in heritage institutions, mostly museums, that house multiple types of art objects or artifacts. This is not going to be extremely relevant to our beloved institutions that are dedicated to numismatics exclusively. While places like the American Numismatic Society and the American Numismatic Association have museums and are themselves repositories of numismatic objects, their internal structure will differ in some ways. Today, we are focused on galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, which are affectionately referred to as the GLAM sector. And these that house multiple discipline-focused collection using the Yale Art Gallery, which I will affectionately call UAG. With this task before us, I offer the following game plan for our time together. Before we delve into some of the treasures of the Yale collection, and I promise we will delve into some of the treasures, I would like to quickly introduce my background. I will also offer a brief introduction to the typical museum roles, as I mentioned, with whom you are most likely to communicate in pursuit of object information and images. And then finally, I will offer a very brief intro to the Yale University Numismatic Collection, And I would be remiss to do so without also mentioning Charles Willis Betts to this group of people. The focus throughout will be glued on the issue of easing access and hopefully providing a bit of clarity to the questions of collections access and image procurement. My introduction to the wonderful world of numismatics was a bit of an accident. I am a trained museum professional with a degree in museum studies, also called museology, and I am now a PhD candidate in art history with the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. My scholarship focuses on collecting, decorative arts, transitions of value, and the arts of engraving. Despite this, I have found myself specializing in several fields of the numismatic discipline, including Washington tokens and early American medals. I have been unbelievably fortunate in that I have worked at two of the nation's most significant numismatic museum repositories, the Smithsonian's National Numismatic Collection, housed down the road in Washington, D.C., and I urge you, if you have time during this trip, to make the travel down there. It is worth it. And the Yale University Art Gallery, which is the largest university collection in the United States. And in both of these museum-focused institutions, I really fell in love with this discipline and continue to foster my knowledge through collections management and curatorial research. At both places, I did notice a few common streams of confusion occurring when collectors, and specifically collectors of US materials, would seek out objects. And once again, using the UAG and some of my favorite selections from the Betts bequest, I aim to remediate these pockets of confusion so that we might all better access numismatic objects, grow the discipline, and become more familiar with cultural heritage repositories. So, it's beneficial for us all, myself included, to better understand the organizational structure of a typical museum team, including key staff positions and their respective roles, and truly, who's the boss of who. This overview provides a bit of insight into the functions of museum personnel, and each of them play a critical role in supporting your research needs. Understanding these roles and knowing whom to contact can really streamline your interactions with museum staff, especially when you need access to objects or detailed information on a bit of a time crunch. We're going to focus on 5 roles in particular today: the collections curator, the collections manager, a registrar, the director, and the chief curator. So if you remember nothing else from my talk today, but you find yourself in need of some objects in a museum in the next few months, remember those words. The collections curator is one of the central figures you will likely encounter. If you're interested in exploring objects housed with any museum or any repository in that GLAM sector, it's highly probable a curator will be on staff. The curator holds primary responsibility for the intellectual oversight and interpretation of the collection, serving as the authoritative figure on its historical and cultural significance. Curators typically contribute to the scholarly output of the institution, engaging in activities like publishing research findings, organizing public engagement initiatives, and sometimes coordinating educational events. Additionally, they play a decisive role in exhibition planning, selecting which objects to display, and crafting interpretive content, including label text and multimedia components. Curators act as the primary interpreters of the object. They delve deeply into an object's identity, its history, and its context. If you have questions regarding an artifact's creation, the historical circumstances of its production, or how its iconography reflects broader artistic trends, then the curator is likely your ideal point of contact. Curators, however, also contribute meaningfully to the philosophical issues guiding their institutions. Their competence is rooted in a meaningful sum of knowledge, experience, and skill. This helps inform the typical background education of curators in order to advance the practice. And this is beyond trying to resolve the tensions between the academic and the procedural functions, which we all go through. Relying on the nuance of what their competency is, the knowledge, experience, and skills combined, help us frame the understanding of curators as a whole. Why are they different from researchers? Why are they different from collections professionals? The American Association of Museums group dedicated to curators, belovedly called CureCom, for short, has addressed some of the idiosyncrasies experienced by members of the discipline. Chief among them is to have a specialization while also being a voice for their general collection. So, for example, I mentioned earlier that my scholarship pertains to things like decorative arts and material culture. But as curator of Yale's collection, I am responsible for holding knowledge for more than 200,000 objects from ancient Greece and China through to modern polymer banknotes and everything in between. The role of curator for numismatic collections is all-encompassing, overwhelming, and unbelievably fun. Yale is fortunate in that we host 2 curators, allowing us to each bring a deep specialized knowledge to our work while also being able to rely on one another if our brain gets stuck in a particular time period or geographic location. Many of you know my colleague Ben Helling, so pretend he is here for this part of the talk. Not every collection is so lucky, and I'm really grateful for the team I have and our capabilities together. Another pivotal role within the museum's operational framework is that of the collections manager. This position may be known by various titles depending on which GLAM you're working with. This could be a museum assistant, a museum specialist, a collection specialist, or even something like an archivist or an archival technician. And that just depends on the nomenclature of the institution. The variations often reflect the evolving personifications and professionalisms of the collections management as a discipline, which gained prominence in the 1980s. So it continues to get defined and more refined as we grow and become more and more loud, frankly. A collections manager's primary duties include cataloging each item in the collection, assigning unique identification numbers, and we will come back to those, and maintaining detailed records to track the object's location, condition, and accessibility status. They ensure that the physical safety and preservation of the collection remain prioritized, with particular attention given to each object's material composition, whether it's paper, metal, fabric, another option, to determine the appropriate storage and conservation methods. While the curator is focused on creating accurate and meaningful interpretation of the objects, the collections manager is responsible for ensuring that these objects are safeguarded and well preserved, both for current exhibition and long-term storage. During exhibitions, the collections manager collaborates with other departments to confirm that objects are displayed under conditions which prevent damage from environmental factors such as light, temperature, and humidity. For better illustrating this in context, I would like to show you this pie chart comprised of various tasks and responsibilities bound up in the role of a typical month of assignment. This was created by a colleague of mine from a museum focused on art and history named Becky Fiffield. She created this excellent and terrifying chart after tracking her time by task during the month of January in 2012. As clearly demonstrated by each slice, as well as the accompanying percentages, every day is going to look a little bit different for the collections manager. I really like using Becky's pie chart as it does a wonderful job conveying the confluence and chaos of this role and helps explain the many directions in which the collections manager can be pulled. Often when collectors are seeking images from a museum space, frustrations arise at the amount of time required. I will delve into this a bit more in a few minutes, but do want to highlight this chart as part of the reasoning behind the wait. It is not at all intentional. The greatest thing you, the collecting community, can do to ensure that you receive the images you need is to ask for them as early as possible. Last-minute publication quality images are extremely difficult for heritage professionals to provide, and it is not for lack of desire to support you in your own endeavors. Your work is so highly valued by the heritage community, but it cannot override any directives which staff members receive from management or impede these daily activities required to ensure proper collection stewardship and care. In larger institutions, additional staff roles may support the curators and collections managers' efforts. For example, a curator may lead a team of research assistants or curatorial assistants. These are individuals who often specialize in specific topics or areas within a collection. They undertake thorough research on a particular object to enhance the museum's understanding of the object's historical background, perhaps its provenance or its artistic value. Similarly, a collections manager may work alongside other collection staff, such as cataloging assistants or digitization specialists. To manage extensive collections, this is extremely common. You may be familiar with similar titles from auction companies, and the jobs themselves are not that different. They are producing identification, taking images, and doing their best to make the collection as accessible as possible to the public. These additional roles help to ensure accurate cataloging, condition monitoring, and digitization of records, which support both physical and digital accessibility of the collection. It's very important to note that roles within the museum team may overlap, and their functions are often collaborative rather than rigidly separated. Furthermore, institutional internal reporting structures can vary significantly, meaning that a curatorial assistant might report to a different department head than the curator, and likewise for collection staff. They might report to someone who has absolutely no knowledge about numismatics. A similar major position to be familiar with for requesting object information and especially images is a registrar. Registrars are the legal czars of objects for tracking things like legal title, provenance, documentation, packing, shipping, transit security, and things of that sort. If you have ever donated an object to a museum, you have worked either directly or indirectly with a museum registrar. In many institutions, this role is also responsible for managing copyright. So photography requests of certain types of materials would require their approval. Sometimes the role of the registrar is combined with collections managers, and there is some overlap in the required training and skill cultivation. So I want you to think of that pie graph and just add another slice. When seeking information, images, or research access to specific objects, it really is essential to understand the structure of the museum staff and to identify the most appropriate individual to approach. Museums are, by nature, stewards of public heritage, and their staff strive to balance accessibility with conservation and preservation responsibilities. However, they must also adhere to the policies and priorities set by their institution's leadership. Knowing these nuances can enhance your interactions with museum personnel and support a productive research experience, which is my goal. Leadership starts with the board of directors, but for the purposes of this talk, we're going to begin with the director. The director is responsible for the stewardship, care, display, access, and fundraising for the whole of the museum, and this is for both objects and staff employees. While the director is a great person to know, a relationship with them is not necessary for object access. However, the director is often responsible for the dispensation of funds, as well as directing how to pursue fundraising, especially focusing on fundraising for specific positions, collections, initiative, exhibitions, and I don't know, numismatic object access. There is usually some flexibility here. For example, if you're looking to fund a specific digitization project, you could probably work with the curator and a member of the development staff team, but you would still need the director's buy-in. In larger institutions, there will likely be a chief curator or a director of collections. This is the role that sits between the director and the collections curator. And this person is very good for you to know. They will be directly responsible for setting specific yearly goals for the curatorial and collections team members. So if you request a substantial number of objects, of images, or background context information, it's very likely that the team member completing this work will need to get approval by the chief curator, or at the very least, their passive acknowledgement of the efforts due to the amount of time required. Having a relationship with either of these people, while not necessary, helps us grow the numismatic discipline It helps us communicate that this community of people is invested in growing our collection, in exhibiting it, and that there is a public who wants to see and learn from the collections housed in these repositories. So be loud in forming these relationships. Numismatics and heritage institutions is like every other department in that leadership will be more supportive of department-led initiatives if they are already funded. Bonus points if they can generate funding, even for nonprofits. Just because an institution has funding does not mean that the numismatic department has funding. And this is probably the most frustrating part of museum work, both for the staff and the public. Monetary support comes from central repositories, most readily in the form of daily, monotonous, albeit important activities, like HVAC support, electrical, occasionally staff salaries, security, plumbing, the basics of modern human civilization. So if the museum with which you are working, even one with, I don't know, an institutional renown for its finances, the government, or a major university, it's still, unfortunately, unlikely that the numismatic collection, or any collection for that matter, will see the benefits of that. The department will still likely need to generate funding for special exhibitions, for symposia, for collections rehousing, and significantly for digitization projects. So keep that in mind when you are befriending my boss's boss, and perhaps his boss, or the people in power at your local museums, the museums that house objects you want to work with. Build relationships with them. And then when they're doing the yearly budget, perhaps they will think of you, and in turn, think of me. With these roles and responsibilities in mind, I would like to offer a proper introduction to Yale's numismatic collection, a brief foray into its history within the college and university, and then let's do some hands-on exploration into how to best access our fabulous items, first online and then in person. I will be focusing, as I mentioned, on pieces from the collection of Charles Willis Betts, notably his early American medals and medallions, a few tokens, but please keep in mind the basic principles are similar for all of the collection's objects across geographic origin and time period. Numismatics has potentially been a part of Yale since its inception in 1701. We have records of students having coins in their common room, but don't know much more than that. We do know that prior to the year 1854, Yale College owned, as it called, a quote, a small collection of coins, unquote, which included a rare New England 3-pence, 24 Roman, 3 Greek, and 1 Byzantine coin. I believe these were on display in the library of Yale College. By the end of the year 1854, Mr. Thomas H. Johns bequeathed a collection of 800 coins to the collection, creating a modest, albeit fully fledged numismatic collection. In 1860, Yale began the process of creating a dedicated cabinet of coins and displayed a small number of these in its brand new Jonathan Trumbull Paintings Gallery, which is the predecessor of the Art Gallery. About 1,000 of these coins originated in the British Empire or its historic predecessors. We know there were coins of several Saxon kings, including Ethelred, and a silver penny of William the Conqueror. We also know there was incomplete dynastic succession of coins up to Edward I, but excluding the Cromwells for some reason. There were small but rare pieces of French currencies, some Turkish coin, a single piece of Japanese money, and a strong representation of the German states, including the Archbishopric of Cologne and Hamburg. American coins included strikes before 1775, Washington pieces, coins struck between 1771 and 1776, the 4th, 5th, and 6th issues of the U.S. Mint, medals and tokens struck before 1792. By 1863, the collection had gained around 1,000 more pieces, now totaling 3,000. Henry Champion of the class of 1860, who he himself gave over 2,000 coins, began a detailed cataloging of the ancient material, which was supplemented 2 years later by Fisk Parson Brewer, who served as the supervisor of the collection. From the onset of the Civil War in 1865, to the 1880s, the collection underwent an incredible and uncontrollable amount of growth. By 1868, the collection totaled approximately 75,000 coins, thanks to donations by several well-known alumni, including Dr. Andrew Pratt, class of 1847, George A. Kitteridge of the class of 1855, and delightfully for our purposes, Charles Willis Betts from the class of 1867. As we all know, Betts is a central figure for C4, as well as for Yale. So what better collection than his for us to use as case study? Now, I must ask your pardon, specifically to Chris. I would be remiss not to speak briefly on Betts since I'm here as a representative of Yale. I know most of this has already been captured in Chris's publication, but pardon me the next few minutes. Charles Willis Betts, who I affectionately call CW, was born on August 13th in 1845 to father Judge Frederick Joel Betts and mother Mary Ward Scoville. And yes, Mary Ward Scoville shared an ancestor with James and William Scoville of Scoville manufacturing fame. As a Connecticut resident, I too must mention that. CW was a studious boy, but was indisposed for some of his youth due to significant illness. His affliction was so severe that he required homeschooling for a few years, during which time he discovered coin collecting. It was common for young men of the period to learn a few hobbies, mostly the basics of etching. As we probably all know, we assume Betts was no different. By 1860, he began developing skills as an engraver, particularly a die engraver, a talent which he developed over the next few years. These years in which he collected, sold, and created numismatic pieces established a firm foundation upon which his love for the field would grow. And the necessary quick digression for my Betts scholars in the room, his experimentation with engraving and striking was never intended to be counterfeit activity in the strictest sense of the word. Instead, these were activities of a burgeoning artist and a bored young boy, discovering an interest in the minuscule art forms of engraving. These so-called Betts fantasy pieces were originally sold as such, but hubris and delusions of grandeur led several dealers to bypass the clearly labeled fantasies, which were well recorded in the contemporary literature. CW entered Yale College in 1863, forever connecting him to the small New England college. He graduated 4 years later, claiming several prizes for his writing abilities, before moving on to Columbia Law School. He graduated from this pursuit in 1869 and began practicing law in New York. He returned to graduate studies at Yale in 1871, but left 2 years later before attaining his PhD, which would have been in Anglo-Saxon, German, and English history, together with literature. Betts left his graduate studies to practice law with his older brother, Frederick H. Betts. First at the firm Whitney and Betts, then the law office of F.H. and C.W. Betts, which in turn would grow into Betts, Atterbury, and Betts by 1878. This final firm specialized in patent cases. In 1884, CW again returned to coin collecting, becoming a member of the American Numismatic Society soon after. Both during his time at Yale and in the years later during his return to the field, CW, quote, devoted much time to the care of the collection, unquote. He, quote, gave much time to the arrangement and description of the college coin collection and contributed freely to its increase, unquote. That leads me to believe he donated much more than we are aware of, and unfortunately may never know how much he truly impacted the Yale coin collection. While at Yale, he was a member of several societies, notably the Scroll and Key, which is one of Yale's infamous secret societies. At his death on Wednesday, April 27, 1887, CW held a prominent collection of English silver, the bulk of which went to the Kingsley Trust Association, which is the incorporated form of Yale's Scroll and Key Society. Betts bequeathed approximately 1,100 numismatic objects to Yale, and again, the majority relating to the American Revolutionary era and his Admiral Vernon medals. According to the 50th reunion class book, it also included, quote, early colonial coins, pieces from almost every foreign country, occasionally Roman pieces, of silver and copper, and in one instance, an Egyptian coin of the time of the Ptolemies. Meaning, C.W. Betts's collection touches most of Yale's numismatic scope. For context, our collection is currently broken down by this approximation. The Greco-Roman holdings remain the greatest strength of the collection, for now. Highlights include early coinage of Western Asia Minor, Roman Republican silver, the Professor Peter R. and Leonor Franca collection of more than 4,100 pieces of Greek cities and the provinces, coins from the excavation at Dura Europos, and the Ben Lee Damsky collection, which is about 900 objects, including substantial imperial holdings. The Byzantine Empire is represented by more than 2,300 gold, silver, and bronze coins dating from the reign of Anastasius I, beginning at 461. The collection also boasts a small but thorough collection of Arab Byzantine medals. Medieval numismatics are represented in strong examples of the English and German traditions. Highlights include the Tripolis hoard of Crusader coins and Crusader coins of the kingdoms of Cyprus and Jerusalem, as well as French seigneurial coins and Crusader pieces. Paper money and financial documents represent another 30,000 or so. Of special focus for us is obviously the colonial and United States coinage, which includes the Marble Brady Garvin collection of pioneer gold and American coinage, as well as our early American medals, and as I mentioned, many from Betts. This latter bequest includes medals related to the American Revolution, my favorite, the War of 1812, the World's Fairs, and Washingtoniana. Using Betts's impeccable publication, American Colonial History, illustrated by contemporary medals, which we're all very familiar with, let's go on a quest through some of Yale's collection, hopefully equipping everyone here with the tools needed to access numismatic items housed in museums and institutional collections. While Yale does not own every medal represented in Betts's monograph, it is a great place to start. I do believe at one point in time we owned every medal in this monograph. Where they left to, I would love to talk to you about after this. To begin our case study, we're going to start with online access. And again, I'm using Yale's collections website, but most GLAM websites should have a similar structure. I'm going to begin with one of my favorite Betts medals, this medal of Benjamin Franklin. It is technically an adjacency to the Comitia Americana medals produced during the early days and even before the early days of the United States. The medal was engraved by an unknown hand, and perhaps the mystery that surrounds its origin is the rationale behind so few numismatists writing about the enigmatic medal. Herbert Gruber, Betts himself, Charles Coleman Sellers, Michael Hoder, and thankfully John Adams and Anne Bentley have tackled this troublesome medal. In his Numismatic Chronicle publication, Gruber offered the following dictation for the medal's existence. It's a long quote, but I think it's worth it. Quote, "This medal was struck during Franklin's visit to England, having been appointed in 1764 to resume his agency at the court of Great Britain. The medal probably refers to the inquiry made by the Privy Council relative to some political papers which had been clandestinely furnished to him, and which he forwarded to America, where they were published. And if you're familiar, these are the Hutchinson letters," unquote. His explanation is expanded upon by Charles Coleman Sellers, adding the existence of letters exchanged between Josiah Wedgwood and Thomas Bentley. Bentley sent the former a copy of this medal and described it as, quote, "the brazen head," unquote. Ultimately, Wedgwood rejected reproducing the subject matter, but the correspondence does suggest a strike date that matches the displayed 1777. As you can probably tell, I ascribe to the Bentley-Adams interpretation that the medal is of British origin. A major argument of this is the similarity in fabric adorning Franklin to those on similar Voltaire and David Hume medals. Christopher Eimer and Richard Margolis have written on this similarity. Though likely English in origin, the medal was most assuredly not struck at the Tower Mint nor at the Birmingham Mint. In fact, in my opinion, it was not struck at a mint at all, but in the shop of an artisan or metalsmith. I really adore how Adams and Bentley conclude their section on this metal, stating simply that, quote, "The secret of this metal is that it is a secret metal," unquote. Betts's version of this metal, and by version, I do not mean his artistic creation, I mean the metal that he owned, is depicted on page 247 of his monograph and stands as number 547. Using Betts and Bentley and Adams' description, we now have the tools necessary to look for the metal in a museum repository using an online search mechanism. Using these reference information pieces, we can create a list of search terms. In this instance, I would suggest the name of the honorand, Benjamin Franklin, the Betts number, 547, the date of creation, 1777, and the measurements, which I did not write down for tonight. I must note here that the Betts number should not be treated, or excuse me, as the museum object number. It should be ancillary information to help us narrow down the objects in the museum, not the solitary piece of information to give to a collections team member. While these numbers are so imperative for research purposes, if you give them to a collections manager, technician, or someone who likely does not have a background in numismatics, it will not help them find the metal. With that said, and preliminary steps completed, we can now head to the collection search page of the website. So museums typically have some level of digital cataloging information, which should always be treated as the first line of attack. If you, the researcher, are able to deduce how the museum refers to the object, especially that object or catalog number, then your quest will go much more quickly. I imagine all of us in this room have searched a museum collection online, so much of this won't look different, but I am hoping some of these tips will be fruitful for your research. Okay, so we've navigated to the website, and we see 4 tabs at the top, indicating which element of the website we should pursue. We need to search the collection, not the little, not microscope, magnifying glass. That's embarrassing. So we should click collection. Once we click, we are brought to the collections search query page. Yale's website, unfortunately, differentiates between the museum search page and the collection search page. So if you have come to our website and tried to search in the wrong area, I apologize on behalf of the museum. Once we click collection, we are brought to the collection search query page. We can get really specific in our query mechanism, but I would suggest, and for the sake of this demonstration, we are going to start off very simply with Charles Willis Betts as our search term. Obviously, this is going to bring up more than one object, and in the case of the art gallery, it brings up 740. The next thing we can do is add an additional query term based off of our initial list. Again, keeping it really simple, we are just going to add Benjamin Franklin as a search term to our first search term. You may notice, I will show you that later. I mentioned at the beginning of this section the importance of understanding how the museum in which you are searching refers to its objects. And very often that's either an object number or a catalog number. If we navigate to the metal that we believe is the metal of Benjamin Franklin that we are looking for, we ultimately will come to this page. But if you look to the right, you'll notice there is an incorrect engraver listed and the accession number isn't visible. The art gallery calls these numbers accession numbers, and the information can be found on every object record. However, you do need to scroll down. So when we scroll down, we wait until we see this number. It very often will be comprised of 3 parts. However, it will not always be comprised of 3 parts. So the best thing you can do is look for the title, accession number, object number, catalog number, something that is not the Betts number. While museums may refer to this with slight differences, really any distinct number the museum uses will help you communicate effectively with the staff. It is especially important when working with collection staff, as I mentioned, who may be do not have familiarity with the terms that you do. A great example I like to use is if you're looking for a double eagle, don't tell them you're looking for a double eagle. Tell them you're looking for a gold $20 coin. It's very, very clear. Let's do another example. So that first example was relatively easy for several reasons. The metal had been digitized, it had an online record, and it had an image. It was the first metal that popped up in our search. Because of the massive expanse of numismatic collections, however, that's very often not the case. And lack of digital rendering of records does not mean the collection isn't usable or valued. It more than likely has something to do with allocation of funds within the organization, or the organization being understaffed. While this can be frustrating, I really encourage you not to interpret a lack of digital infrastructure as a slight to our discipline or an incompetency on the part of the staff. With these qualities in mind, let's dictate some other options for discovering numismatic objects in museums and heritage collections. Perhaps those that aren't digitized, those that are misidentified, or those that have incomplete documentation. This is a 1694 elephant token produced in London, England. While the origin of these tokens is not known, there is significant conjecture that they were created relatively after the London fire of 1666. There are 7 variations of elephant tokens, 4 referred to as the London varieties, and 3 referred to as the Carolina or New England varieties. This obviously is one of the latter 3. Regardless of variety, all elephant tokens were produced at the London Tower Mint and depict a large tusked elephant on the obverse. There are 2 known dies for all iterations of the obverse. On the first iteration, the elephant is more central on the planchet, allowing the tusks to be separate from the milled border. The other die sees the elephant positioned slightly to the left, forcing the tusk to almost touch the planchet's border. This token is one of the 3 Carolina New England varieties, thankfully the rarer of the series. Like the London varieties, the elephant dominates the full obverse, but the reverse offers a simple motto and the date of 1694. It reads, "God preserve Carolina and the Lord Proprietors, 1694," correcting an earlier misspelling of proprietors with an E at the end rather than an O. The elephant's tusks are positioned away from the rim, indicating the use of the first of the aforementioned die. It is possible that the Carolina and New England tokens were intended as promotional pieces, increasing interest in British colonies in the New World. However, this is highly refuted. Thomas Snelling, British numismatist, records witnessing 2 of these elephant token dies at the Tower Mint in the year 1769. And though tradition has assigned designs of the dies to the chief engraver of the Tower Mint, John Rotier, there is no evidence connecting him to the engraving or the cutting. So, one such Carolina token is recorded in Betts' monograph. And since we know much of Betts' collection came to Yale, we can postulate that it might be in UAG. Now, beginning the search for this object online, we can utilize the same mechanism we did for the Franklin medal. So we begin by searching Charles Willits Betts and are again met with a significant number of objects. Using the same mechanisms, we will now add elephant token to our first query. However, unlike our first successful pursuit, we have now returned a result of 0 objects found. Cue menacing music. What I was hoping to mention before, that I will mention now, is if you look in my search bar, you'll see there are quotes around Charles Willits Betts. If you are using multiple search terms, especially if they are multi-worded search terms, you have to encase them in quotations. I cannot say that strongly enough. Okay, so search 1 didn't work. So we're going to go back to that initial list we have of possible search terms. If we just remove the name Charles Willits Betts and search elephant token, we do get 1 object returned. So let's select that object, scroll down, and find that accession number. Now here's where things get a little confusing. There's no qualifier indicating that this object has any connection to Betts. This is where I would recommend reaching out to your museum's curatorial staff, providing them with all of the information that we've now required. And it's not a small amount. When communicating with staff members, make sure it's the appropriate staff member. Otherwise, you are just going to get passed around in a circle, not intentionally, but because they're just not going to know what you're talking about. So I would present your query somehow in the following context to a member of curatorial staff. This is content, this is context. So first, you're looking for a coin that at one point belonged to Betts. And two, you believe it's possible it was in the Yale collection. 3, we know the Yale collection has a solitary Carolina elephant token. And 4, you've looked online in the record, but see no connection to Betts. This first line of attack would be to ask if the museum has accession records, and this is important, that are publicly accessible. Keep in mind, they very often are not publicly accessible. But if that's the case, and you are unable to peruse them, you can still ask the collections team if they can add this to their extensive list, and I assure you there is an extensive list of materials that need further digging into. Perhaps they can find the documentation thread, find the single piece of paper you're looking for that link this token to Betts, and then you can use that information to your heart's content. I must admit, in cases like this, the evidence is almost entirely circumstantial. I think that is unfortunately the bulk of the discipline, the way collections have been amassed in these repositories. While the evidence is circumstantial, and not all of us are lawyers in the room, Chris, I do think it's usable and very helpful as we continue to recreate the historic records of these material cultures. With all collections, if you've already queried the online database, or if the collection does not have an online database, you should absolutely reach out to the departmental staff. I think it is more than likely they will invite you in. If they are unable to invite you in, it is their job to steward your visit. And if they're not stewarding your visit, be kind, but be loud. Talk to those people we mentioned earlier who perhaps are supervising them in their endeavors. It's unbelievably impactful to address your questions to the right people and make sure that you're correctly following the hierarchy when necessary. Beginning with any published contact form or a departmental email or a phone number listed on the website. Call, email, be kind, but be persistent. This will ferry your requests into the queue of pending requests. And don't be afraid to cold email a published address. It's out there for a reason. I don't know that anyone in this room would be scared to cold email, but let me encourage you, if you are, do not be. Now, if all of the contact information is listed, definitely feel free to reach out to the person whom you already have a relationship, even if it's not the appropriate party. This is the only time I will bend that rule. If you know them, call them. If you have responsibilities to them, call them. They will reciprocate. Reaching out to the right person, however, will expedite your request. If you need images, the curator, though probably wonderful, is not the right person to ask. It almost certainly will be the collections manager or a member of the collection staff. If you need publication quality images and they are not already available online, you will likely need to work with the photography, visual resources, or digital media departments. And again, reaching out directly to them should be a much quicker and easier process for you and the staff. If you're requesting images for an object that is not yet cataloged or digitized, please keep in mind that this is a long, labor-intensive process for heritage institutions. Publication quality images are very often not captured by the numismatics department. Occasionally they are, and that's great. When they are not, the department must make appointments internally with the institution's photographers. Once those images are captured, the images must be processed and uploaded into a back-end digital asset management system. This is not the website. After they are added to that digital asset management system, then they will be added to the collections database. At the end of that, they will be added to the web for your use. If the collections department can capture these high resolution images on their own, obviously this timeline is shortened. This takes me to my final point of the presentation. I mentioned earlier how funding works for most heritage not-for-profit entities that are part of larger institutions. If the collection houses a group of objects about which you are particularly passionate, and you are finding yourself regularly requesting new images, new documentation, or new cataloging, the quickest and most effective way to gain access to this material is unfortunately to fund a project. And I know that's yucky, but that's how it works. And since I have been asked to speak specifically about my institution, the Yale University Art Gallery, it only makes sense that I also mention our fundraising group, the Engraver Circle. I have had several people ask me why my department has a dedicated friends group when we are part of a university with a significant endowment. And I mentioned this earlier. While we are part of this wonderful university, we do not get additional support for any initiatives beyond basic care for the humans and the objects. Digitization, cataloging, and behind-the-scenes events, conferences, publications, and special exhibitions all provide greater access to the collection's objects. And because of this greater access, they are chief among the things my team wants to provide. I know this is yucky, and I want you to hear me when I say this. If Yale is the place that houses the collection with which you wish to work the most, consider a project like this. However, if it is not Yale, if it is Mass Historical, if it is the Smithsonian, if it is the ANS, if it is a small university in your community, if they have the collections but are not able to provide you with the access you're requesting, this is the quickest and most significantly effective way of getting the director on board, the chief curator on board, and of course, the curator and collections manager. I want to be abundantly clear. I am in no way suggesting that heritage institutions are withholding their objects from the public. All of this material will slowly but surely be cataloged, digitized, and made available in as many formats as possible. What I am suggesting is that galleries, libraries, archives, and museums often put forward more support towards departments or collections that appear popular, lucrative, and good for the public. GLAM leadership needs to know that numismatists care, that there is a body of collectors interested in, for example, the Yale Art Gallery's colonial coins, and that they desire closer engagement with the collection. Unfortunately, the metric used to measure this public interest very often includes dollar signs, but that is not the only way. I invite you to come to Yale, to our public events, and to our exhibitions. Be loud, be excited, and be enthusiastic. Our leadership will see this and continue to, if not grow their support of the numismatics in our institutions, at least see us. And this is true of every GLAM institution. Gaining access to numismatic objects and heritage repositories can be confusing, but if you approach the institution with clarity, patience, and desire to grow your relationship with the staff and importantly, the leadership, there should be zero impediments. Oh my gosh. If you require speed and are able to support collections work financially, I encourage you to do so at whatever institution houses the materials of your passion. But above all else, go to exhibitions, do research in the collection, and come visit. Thank you. Any questions?
Yes, does anybody have any questions for Emily?
And when are you coming?
Jeff Rock has a question for you, Jeff.
What we tell the public is 200,000, just numismatics. Yep. Ask me in a year though, it might be different.
Anybody else have any questions?
Quick question here, just want to emphasis, so, you talked about the website, if someone wants to come and view some of these objects, say at Yale, you know, they may be on display, but if they want to, examine items that are not on display, I assume from your talk that would be the collection staff as opposed to curatorial staff?
Yes, however, as I mentioned, you all now know me and my contact is there. I am happy to facilitate that. I will direct you to my colleague Ellen, but I assure you, we work in the same room. She will respond to you.
Yeah, I've been to Yale a couple of times
Yeah.
to look at the collection. They have a wonderful collection and everyone there has been very helpful. The ANS and Yale both have most of their collection online, and we can use, those are public domain, which is also very helpful because some museums and some places don't have them online, which makes it much more difficult to find out what they have. But Yale has always been very hospitable to colonial collectors, and they have a wonderful colonial collection. So thank you very much.
But those other places too, build those relationships, talk to the people. If you have money, give, make those relationships known to the leadership that you're there and you care, and hopefully they'll get online. Go ahead.
And I should add, if you visit Yale for numismatics, some of the 19th century donors also gave their literature. So both Sterling and the Beinecke have some very important 19th century pieces of numismatic literature.
Yes. But they're not always cataloged where you think they should be.
Yeah.
So talk to me.
You have to look
Yes,
everywhere.
yes.
We have a presentation for you.
Emily, thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I know you'll be hearing from some of us, hopefully a lot of us in the years to
Good.
come. And want to give you this plaque for your wonderful and entertaining talk.
Oh, I'm so honored. Thank you so much. It was lovely.
Before you go, I think we have a question from online. Is that right?
Yes, someone online. How do museums store their numismatic collections?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked. Pardon this.
Must be your friend at Yale who asked.
Yeah, I wonder. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I started in collections management. So this is like incredible. I'm sorry to go back through my entire presentation. You might have noticed this photo of Connecticut coppers. These little boxes are how we store our coins. They are all placed on a tray in the company's called Delta, but it's this big medical looking cabinet that houses approximately, I think 80 trays. And all of these little boxes are archival quality. You can get these through some of the larger museum collection storage and archival producing companies like Hollinger or Gaylord, but ours are actually made by this wonderful woman in Connecticut who hand folds all of these. They're incredible. If you are looking to not store in slips, please let me give you her name. She's incredible. But yes, this is how we predominantly store our coins, our metals. Paper currency is different.
In the past, old collectors would use trays to, what happened is the piece that's against the downside gets slid back and
Yes.
forth each time the tray's open.
Yep.
And you wear it down.
Yep.
So are you sure that's a good way to store them?
Yeah, so we've modernized the process. It's the same looking cabinet thing, but now it's got drops so that you can't drop a tray unless you mean to. And it's got a special coating that so far is preventing that from happening. Now, everything is always dying, right? It's always going away. So this may not be the case in 50 years, and we will revisit it then, but that's what we're doing right now.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
If you missed that Kevin Vinton and Emily went to the same high school, and they had 40. What's that? Yeah, what was the high school? Christian Heritage in Trumbull, Connecticut. And I asked her if they went to prom together, and she said he wishes.